Welcome to Screens of the Stone Age, the podcast where scientists review movies. Fuck, I'm all fucked up now. Welcome to Screens of the Stone Age, the podcast where scientists review movies about prehistoric people. My name is Josh Lindell. I'm a grad student studying Neanderthal teeth, and I'm here with...
I'm Dr. Kim Plomp. I'm a bioarchaeologist. I studied the human skeleton, health and disease, and evolution.
Okay, my name is Predrag Radović. I work at the Department of Archaeology at University of Belgrade, and I'm kind of paleoanthropologist, but I'm also studying some other mammalian remains from the territory of Serbia.
Thanks for being here, Pedja. You've been on the show before, and you introduced yourself. I think you introduced yourself as Predrag, and I'm always going to keep calling you Pedja, so I have to explain that Pedja is a short form of the name Predrag.
Yeah, it's my nickname, sorry.
Today we're reviewing a movie called The Man from Earth from 2007, which you selected off of our list. Yeah. I hadn't seen this one before, but I'd heard about it, and everybody says it's so good, and it looks so low budget. I wasn't actually expecting too much, but it was pretty great. We always spoil the movies because we talk about all parts of the movie, and in most cases, I don't really care too much about that. But in this case, I would say to anybody who hasn't seen this movie, you should probably go check it out first, because there's a couple of pretty interesting twists. And it's definitely going to be worth seeing before we talk about it. But fortunately, it's available for free pretty easily. We just watched it on YouTube, I think. So I'll put a YouTube link in the comments. And if you haven't seen this, go watch it first and then come back to this episode, because I think this is a pretty good movie to go in fresh.
We so rarely tell people to watch it first. We rarely tell them to even watch it. Like, usually we're like, don't watch this movie. We did it for you and it was horrible.
That's true. This is definitely a watch movie. Yes. You should definitely see this one. And we'll get into why it's so good, even though it was a very low budget movie that didn't make a big splash.
Yeah, so everything happens basically in a single room, and a little bit on a porch. But...
Yeah, There's like, 8 main characters sitting around a room talking, and that's the entire movie, and it sounds like it shouldn't be good, but it's actually really good.
Yeah.
Pedja, can I ask you to summarize this movie for us, and you can feel free to spoil it, because we've already warned people to go watch it and then come back.
Okay, so basically, this movie starts with Professor John Oldman, who is the main protagonist of the movie, who is basically packing his belongings onto a truck, and he's obviously preparing to move to a new place, new home. So at one point, his colleagues show up to give him a farewell party, basically. So there are these characters like Harry, who is a biologist, Edith, who is art history professor, and you'll see later, basically a devout Christian. There is an anthropologist called Dan, Sandy, a historian, who is also kind of in love with John, and an archaeologist called Art, and his younger student / partner, Linda. The plan was basically to give him a classical farewell party, although no one's actually aware of the reason why John needs to live. So he basically needs to live. And then the story, at some point, they have a couple of drinks, and then he starts revealing his story. And that the story is should I spoil everything now?
Yeah, go for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in a nutshell, the story is that John is basically, as he's saying, a Paleolithic human who survived for 14,000 years. Is basically an immortal. As I understood, he at some point he says that he doesn't scar, and everyone is cut with that notion. No one believes him But as the story unravels, as he talks more and more, they basically start believing him. So at one point, an archaeologist calls his friend Dr. Will Gruber, who is a psychiatrist, also professor at their university. So he arrives and starts basically talks with John. He's probing him to see if he's basically sane. So at the end, he was so convincing in his story that everyone, as I said, believed him. But they were so desperate to for all this to be fake, that at the end he gives them that. He tells basically, I made up the whole thing, and part of his colleagues are satisfied, the others don't believe him. And towards the end of very end of the movie, there is this big reveal. Should I reveal it? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So he's at one point he's talking with Sandy, this historian girl who is in love with him. That he had many pun names throughout history, and one of those was I think he was Professor T. Party, basically a pun to the Boston Tea Party, and Dr. Will hears that, and he realizes that basically he was his father. So the whole story ends up rather, a bit pathetic for my taste. But anyways, the Dr. Will dies. He has heart attack, and then this prehistoric human basically packs the rest of his stuff and basically leaves. And at the last moment, he stops, and the historian girl, goes with him. So he just drives into the night. So that's basically like the outline of the movie. But we'll come to the details of his incredible story a bit later, I guess.
That's that's the overview. You missed out the part where he's also Jesus, which is kind of.
So we're gonna
inadvertently.
Yeah, as I understood, I took some notes, and I basically planned that we discuss and fact check some of the things that he says, and there are many of those.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So let's start with some fact checking. Normally we point out lots of the inaccuracies. This one has a lot to talk about, and at least in terms of the Paleolithic stuff, it seems pretty well researched. Doesn't seem like there's some major inaccuracies. Regarding the theological stuff, I'm not as certain, but it seems to match up with my understanding of things. So yeah, it seems like a pretty well researched story to me.
I thought it was really cute when he had the stone tool and he got it from the thrift shop, and they were like, so after he finished the story and everything, they're like, so the stone tool, is it from your time? He's like, no, seriously, from the thrift shop. It was cute.
Yeah, so the one thing that I found pretty cliche at the very beginning of the movie, this archaeologist guy called Art, he's basically this long gray-haired biker professor who is coming, of course, with his bike and with his student girlfriend. Imagine that. So it's kind of cliche for archaeologists to behave that way, at least in Serbia. But I guess
I don't know. I mean, it's uncomfortable, but I'm sure there's truth to that. I'm sure that cliche exists for a reason.
Yep.
Anyways, I found it a bit cheesy, so to say. Yeah. So
yes.
So this guy John, basically he's a well-studied man, and at some point he explains that he has I think 10 doctorates in many fields. So when he talks about his incredible life, he also says that he's informed into science. So he traced his origin basically in the Magdalenian culture at the end of the upper Paleolithic of Western Europe to about 14,000 years ago. Right. So one of the things in which this movie is definitely dated, I think, is the movie came out in 2007, right, Josh?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he is this basically just European white guy. But from the recent genetic studies, we know that most of these Western European hunter-gatherers from the Upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic had darker skin. So
That's a good point. I didn't even think about that, but that is true.
yeah. So this biologist guy called Harry, he's pretty interesting character, and at one point he says that humans are biologically designed to live 190 years. So
Yeah, I Googled that. I was like, really? I don't think that's true.
yeah, so I actually found a recent paper which says that leading demographers claim that human lifespan is fixed at the natural limit of around 122 years. So
Yeah.
yeah, so
I found one that said 150 years, so I don't think I mean, how could you even really decide that if you took away?
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
of course. And he also says that you could extend your life via perfect cell regeneration, which I also found a bit too specific and too odd and too simplistic to extend one's
Yes,
life.
very much. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Maybe he was thinking about like telomere regeneration. If you can replicate your cells without shortening your telomeres, then maybe that would be the case. Because that's why aging happens, right? It's the telomeres get shorter. Is that the deal?
Yeah, that's one of the important mechanisms in aging. That telomeres get shortened as cells divide through time. So, but that's just only one aspect of the complex story of aging, as I understood it. So another thing which I found kind of funny and cheesy at the same time was that John, this main character, John, is throughout the movie he's characterized as a caveman and Cro-Magnon and as Magdalenian, also as a primitive man.
Yeah. And he said that he learned about what he was, which I liked, is that he didn't have this vast of knowledge. He explained that he knew what he was by piecing together memories with what he learned later, right?
Yeah.
I thought that was kind of well done, how they made sure to say that.
Yeah, that was pretty great. He said, I think I might have written a quote down here. He said, I didn't write the quote down. He basically said he's not omniscient. He just has one man's perspective throughout all of history, and most people throughout history didn't know very much. So he had to learn about his past from people in the present learning about his past, because he only knew about the people immediately around him. I thought that was neat. Mm-hmm. Basically, for hundreds or thousands of years, he'd never even seen the ocean, basically, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and at one point he says that he started going towards the rising sun, right, towards the east, and then he saw ocean, and then he says Mediterranean, and I was like, Mediterranean is not an ocean, but anyways. So another thing which I found interesting in his presentation, he's describing this early upper Paleolithic life, and he says that they were semi-nomadic, following the weather and the game we hunted. That's the quote.
Mm-hmm.
And there is an inconsistency as far as I can see. So he says that he was born about 14,000 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then he says the first 2,000 years were cold. We learned it was warmer at lower elevations, late glacial maximum, I assume. So correct me if I'm wrong, but late glacial maximum lasted from about 25 to about 19-ish thousand years ago, right? So it should have ended by the time he was born, right?
Yeah, you're probably going to know that better than me, but I
Yeah, me
understand the
too.
Magdalenian is like a post last glacial
Yeah.
maximum culture, right?
That's the thing.
Yeah, it went to 12,000, I think, when I Googled.
Mm.
Well, the Magdalenian, not, I don't know about the Ice Age.
Yeah, so for Magdalenian, I think that it ranged from around 17 to around 11,000 years ago, as I understood. So this is a bit of inconsistency, I think, right?
But they could get that away with that because it's just based on his piecing together memories. So they
Right.
can almost, I mean,
but
right?
Yeah, but he says explicitly late glacial maximum, I assume. So
Yes.
yeah. So that's the thing. And he also describes that he traveled to the west and that he saw a land between France and Britain,
Hmm.
basically Doggerland or Dodgerland, however you pronounce that. Are you familiar with the term?
Yep.
No.
Yeah, Doggerland is, it would have been like a low plains connecting the British Isles to the mainland. And there would have been lots of people living there up until it flooded when the Ice Age ended, right? So there's a lot of archaeological sites underwater there. Like fishermen dredge up Paleolithic artifacts from the seafloor there all the time.
I mean, that's interesting. So Britain was not an island, but a peninsula in those times. So basically, what I found is that this land connection between Britain and mainland Europe existed to about 6,500 before Common Era. So it is possible that he could have seen it, of course. It fits with the proposed chronology.
And the geography works out too, because he says he's Magdalenian. This is based on the site La Madeleine in France, which would have been in a mountainous area. And if you went to the west, you would have been overlooking Doggerland towards the British Isles. So the geography mostly checks out, right?
Right. So what I also researched is that he saw a man working, making the rock art, basically, and he says that the man was called Giraud, who drew animals we wanted to kill. So I googled it, and Giraud is actually a boy's name of the old German and old English origin, meaning spear ruler or spear brave. So it's basically a pun.
Wow.
Interesting.
Yeah. And and another thing, he says that this man drew animals they wanted to kill. I think this refers to the theory, anthropological theory on which tries to explain part of Paleolithic rock art, and which interprets the paintings as a kind of utilitarian hunting magic to increase the abundance of prey. There's that story.
Mm-hmm.
So I think whoever wrote the script for this movie actually researched literature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if they have a background in anthropology or archaeology.
Yeah.
Well, they don't, because the writer of this script was he wrote several episodes of the original Star Trek and an episode of Twilight Zone and a whole bunch of similar stuff throughout the 50s and 60s. He basically finished writing this script on his deathbed in 1998. He had like his grandson, he dictated the last of it and had his grandson type it basically on his deathbed. Whoa. I don't know why it took 9 years for it to get finally made, but this was the last thing he ever wrote.
Wow.
And now that you mention it, one of the actors, the one who portrays Harry, the biologist, is actually. I watched him in Star Trek Enterprise. He was a doctor on the spaceship Enterprise. So that's the connection for Trekkies.
Yeah, they bring up Star Trek too. At the end, he's like, when the story's over, the guy's like, I'm just going to go home and watch a Star Trek episode.
Oh, yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, the writer is Jerome Bixby, so he was a writer for the original Star Trek. There's other Star Trek connections as well. I don't remember specifically which actors, but several of the actors in this show have been in different series of Star Trek, at least sort of, one-off episodes or stuff like that. So lots of connections to Star Trek for sure. And there's apparently similarities between this plot and some episodes of Star Trek and Twilight Zone. There's an original Star Trek episode with a character called Methuselah, or the episode is called Methuselah, where there is a character like this who's been alive for thousands of years.
Oh, yeah. I think I remember that one. And there is also, I think you guys haven't noticed this, but I did. So there is a reference to a cigarette smoking man. It's basically a reference to the famous X-Files character, CGB Spender. The guy who always smokes cigarettes and covers up everything.
I know the cigarette smoking man from X-Files. What was the reference in here?
Yeah, at some point he says, I don't want some cigarette smoking man to keep me locked somewhere and get me, probed, etc.
Okay, so here's another fact check. When they're right in the beginning, there's a great little sequence where they're doing lots of science talk about the Paleolithic. One of the things is they were asking about the difference between people from the Paleolithic and now, and they say that they're basically, the same as us. They're as smart as us. They say there's no anatomical difference between Cro-Magnon and us, and then the archaeologist interjects, except as a rule we've grown taller. My understanding is that we are shorter, or at least for most of human history, we've been shorter than Paleolithic people. Is that right?
Well, should I tell it? I recently read actually about this. So apparently, the upper we do not know much about postcranial skeletons of Paleolithic humans in general, but European Upper Paleolithic record is pretty good. So the scientists inferred that these people were actually pretty tall, and they even connected it to their relatively recent African / Near Eastern origin. So yeah. They probably got this wrong here. I think you're right. So about Cro-Magnons, how you pronounce it, or Cro-Magnon in French. So the thing is that people still call earliest modern humans in Europe Cro-Magnons, basically because these were historically the first Paleolithic skeletons discovered in Europe in the second half of the 19th century. So French prehistorian Louis Lartet actually excavated the famous site where he found a couple of skeletons, and although they thought that they were much older, but we today know that these skeletons were redated. So they thought they were like 40,000 years old, but now we know that they're about 27 something thousand years ago. So they're much younger, but the term is still used outside science, basically to refer to early modern humans in Europe.
Yeah, we talked about Cro-Magnon before. So, like you say, Cro-Magnon is a site in France. And so, strictly speaking, when we talk about Cro-Magnon in paleoanthropology, we're usually referring to specifically these skeletons from this specific site. And nobody really uses Cro-Magnon generally to refer to Upper Paleolithic cultures anymore, do we? We only, in science, only use it to refer specifically to that site in France.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, but in popular culture, it is still present.
Yes.
Yeah.
The term Cro-Magnon or Cro-Magnon seems to be like waning in popular culture, I think. There's not a lot of stuff in the last couple of decades that use the term Cro-Magnon. But like back in the 90s, so many of the movies we've watched use the term Cro-Magnon.
Yeah, I made this particular note also. As I've said, I generally dig the movie, and it is pretty much consistent considering the time when it was made, etc. But at one point, the archaeology student, Linda, asks, did you have a pet dinosaur? And I cringed. I cringed like hell.
Yes.
I mean, an archaeology student would not ask such thing.
No.
Definitely.
She asked a good question early on, and I was impressed. But then she asked that stupid question later. So early on, she said they were talking about height. She said, "What's the selective advantage of height?" And I'm like, "Yes, that's a great question because I'm always talking to my students about evolution when I'm teaching evolution. You have to imagine what the selective advantage is because evolution doesn't think about what might be good in the future. It specifically acts on when there's a selective advantage." And they go into some of the possible selective advantages of height, which is the one guy says to see predators better over tall grass.
Yeah.
But then, who is it? The anthropologist, I think, says that you can radiate heat more effectively in warm climates, which is also true. Probably better than seeing predators over tall grass.
Yeah, so he's basically referring to the Bregman's and Allen's rules, right?
Mm-hmm.
She also was the one that figured out that his last name was a pun.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking they were going to let that go under the radar because it's like halfway through the movie, somebody, the mover calls him Mr. Oldham, and I'm like, Mr. Oldman.
Yeah.
And they could have let that fly and just be like a little Easter egg. It's fun that they brought it up, but it could have been fun without bringing it up too, I think.
Yeah, but bringing it up paved the way for him to figure out.
Yeah, that's true. That was important. It was
paved the way for the sun to come out. Yeah.
It was important for the plot, yeah. So it's forgivable.
Yes.
Anyway, the student, I got the impression she's a first-year student because she doesn't seem to really know anything at all. But Pedja, certainly you're teaching now. You must be figuring out that first-year students coming into archaeology don't really know anything because where do people learn about archaeology? Maybe you have a better archaeology education in high school in Serbia because I know your system sort of focuses in high school a lot better than ours does.
Well, basically, recently I had a student who wrote that first tools were made like 15 million years ago. So he was a bit...
The first tools... Well, I mean, depending on how we characterize tools, there's a lot of stuff coming out about monkeys using tools. So, I mean, tools have probably been used for tens of millions of years. But the first tools made by humans, or the first stone tools made by humans, are about 3 million years at the farthest extent.
Yeah, so far.
I remember in Serbia, in the field, our professor, Dusan, was talking, or I heard through somebody else that he had a student who asked him how the Neanderthals lived underground because we dig them up from underground, and she was trying to figure out how they were living underground that we dig them up there.
Okay.
That's so cute.
But since I've been teaching this archaeology and popular culture course, lots of students take that course without studying archaeology. A lot of them, it's their first archaeology course, and a lot of people think that humans lived with dinosaurs, or more specifically, that archaeologists dig up dinosaurs. But I mean, there are still people that think humans live with dinosaurs because they don't really teach that in high school.
I think that we are still living with dinosaurs called birds. When we say
of course, dinosaurs didn't go extinct.
Mean non-avian dinosaurs, just to be precise here.
Non-avian dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Yes.
I've got a dinosaur feeder hanging in the tree outside my window, so I can watch the birds while I'm working, or watch the dinosaurs while I'm working.
So another thing, there are all these nice little stories within this story which I found very intriguing and which got me thinking. So at one point he said that they asked him first if he ever met someone else who's like him, and he said that he did, that he sensed that this person was like he is, and he met him or her in the I think in 17th century, and then again at the bus station in Brussels. So I found that interesting.
He thought he saw him, but he's not sure.
Yeah, he thought he saw him. Right.
But they should. Have you guys seen the Sandman series, the new one?
No.
So in the Sandman series, the Sandman is like a supernatural, all-powerful being or whatever, and he gives a man immortality. And he does it just because he's curious and is bored with life. So he gives this man immortality, and he says I think it's every 100 or 200 years or something, they have to meet at this pub.
Oh.
And he wants to know whether he still wants immortality. Like, is this a good, like, are you still happy? Do you want it to end? Like, what's happening, right? And so he meets him every however long, 100 years or whatever, and he goes through, and it's really well done, because the guy, goes from being like super rich and then goes and gets really poor and gets the plague, and like he sees them all going all through it, and the pub just gets modernized and modernized and modernized. And so I don't know why he wouldn't have done that. Like, if you're like, okay, we're both immortal, they just, I'll see you here in 100 years. That's easy to do if you're immortal.
Yeah, that would be a obvious thing to do, I guess, to figure out over thousands of years. After you've been alive for 1,000 years, plan it out. What if I ever met somebody else? Just like have that in your back pocket, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and also. The whole story made me thinking about psychological consequences and capabilities in a sense of humans. So, would we be able to stay sane, basically, through this extremely extended lifetime? I mean, if we could biologically live forever, would we? That's the question.
I guess it would depend on whether we had neurological decline, which would be it. But then also, I guess it would be your outlook on life, because there would be a certain point you're right, where it would kind of drive you crazy. But then also it would just be, I think you'd just end up going with the flow a lot, right? Like, because things just wouldn't matter as much anymore.
Yeah.
I think humans are pretty adaptable. I think that if it was just given that you would live forever, I don't think you'd have such a big question about, having meaning from having finiteness to it,
Well, I have a problem with meaning of life during my short lifespan already, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I could take such a long life, But alternatively, I read. I think it was Clifford Simak who wrote this short science fiction story in which people do live basically as immortals, but they do this in cycles. So they age and then they de-age. They become babies, and then So in that way, I see that pretty much. Possible, and then
Well, that brings me to the thing that makes me always wonder when I watch these things, like when there's someone who's immortal, and they're always immortal when they're like hot at 35 years old or whatever, right?
like John is.
So what's the ontogeny of an immortal? Yeah, like does he grow up like a normal human and he's alive for 35 years and then just stays stagnant at 35 years old? Or is his childhood and development incredibly long? Like what's the ontogeny? And then if it's incredibly long, then that means that he would have been a child, like a defenseless child for a long time, as his parents would have died around him over and over again.
It's funny that we both write down that same question, obviously thinking
Yeah.
like biologists.
Yeah, but I think that he actually, John explains, he says that he grew up normally, and at some point, people noticed that he doesn't age anymore when
He stopped.
he stopped, and they banned.
But why did he stop
And
at
they banished
35?
him
Why didn't
from
he stop
group.
at 25?
Yeah.
Well,
So that would mean that to me that something like happened to him. So like something supernatural happened to him at that age, not that he and him like something in his biology made it happen, right? So he got like cursed. And that's he said it could be that it was cursed or blessed. It depends on how you see it.
yeah. So in the biological sense, in the sense of biological logic, I guess that his aging would stop when he reached adulthood, basically reproductive, capabilities, etc. So that wouldn't be 35.
But wouldn't that be like 15?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe he reached like 15 or 20, and then his aging after that has been extremely slow. So he aged, from 20 to 35 over 10,000 years. And maybe he's going to age the rest of his life over the next, 30,000 years and eventually reach old age and die. And he says specifically, he's not immortal. He can be killed. He's just really old, right? So maybe he's aging.
He assumes he can be killed.
Well, he assumes he can be killed, of course, because he doesn't
can't
know.
test that. Yeah.
He obviously heals very fast and very thoroughly since he doesn't scar, and he survived his own crucifixion.
Which basically got us to another important aspect of this story. That's the religious aspect, right?
Yeah.
So he apparently during his historical travels, he went to India and met Buddha and became like good friend with Buddha, right? Of course, there is this. I think she's into Christian literature or something. Professor Edith, who's a devoted Christian, and she finds it pretty hard basically. As I understood, she believes his story, but it also the story shatters basically her whole world, which is centered around Christian dogma, right? So basically, what John says,
she believes in the New Testament that it's
the literal, basically the story. So what he says, he basically says that. He's Christ, and they got him wrong.
No, he was Jesus. Christ was a name that was applied to him later, which he didn't like. He specifically said that.
Well, he said that Jesus he's explaining the etymology of the name, but he says that he during those times also called himself John.
I liked how he said he named all the things that have happened since, that has to do with Christianity, all the good and the bad. And then he kind of ends it with it's like, that's not what I meant to happen. Like, that's not what I intended. So his intention was he was just trying to teach the Buddhist ways, which was love and acceptance, right?
Right.
Yeah, he specifically didn't like the warlike nature of the Roman Empire, so he's like, why don't I just share some of the Buddhist teachings with the Roman Empire, and it all got blown out of proportion over history.
Yeah. So then the story from this strange turn, it delves deep, basically into the questions on God and religion in general, and he says when they ask him that he does not believe in God, and he even cites the infinite regress argument, basically, like the question, who created God? If God created everything. So, this argument is frequently pulled by atheists today.
Also, I think about that in terms of Ancient Aliens. We knew, explaining that aliens did everything. Like, okay, cool, maybe they did, but if they did, that kind of isn't an answer. Like,
who made aliens?
If the Egyptians got their technology from aliens, then it explains where the Egyptians got their technology. But where did the aliens get their technology? Like, this is not a satisfying answer to me.
On the same lines is my problem with panspermia theory. It basically says, when we wonder about the origins of life on Earth, there is this theory of panspermia, of course, that basically life as life came from somewhere else, on a meteorite, a comet, or something like that. But it doesn't solve the question. Okay, the life came here, but it had to become somewhere else then. So that's definitely a regress.
And as far as I'm concerned, like, that might be the way life started on Earth, but like it's just not a satisfying answer. If that's the answer, like, okay, I still want to know the answer to where life came from, even if it didn't start on Earth, right? Like, that doesn't end this line of reasoning. This just like adds an extra wrinkle and makes it harder to find the original source of life, but it's not an answer in itself.
These kinds of regresses, these kinds of explanations only, I mean, by time, when regarding some questions.
The religious and meaning of life sort of aspects of the movie are like the real interesting content of the movie, but for the purposes of our podcast, the most interesting things I think are still at the beginning. So there's one more little inaccuracy which we glossed over, but he said he had the opportunity to sail with Columbus and he declined because he was a little afraid that they were going to sail off the edge of the world. But that's a common misconception because Columbus wasn't the first to think the Earth was round. In fact, all educated people going back to the Greeks knew that the Earth was round. The problem was that Columbus got his math really wrong, and he, for some reason, thought the Earth was about a third the size of what everybody else thought it was. He's like, no, I can sail all the way around. It's no problem. And they're like, no, it's too big. You're not going to make it. And it turns out that he would have been... he wouldn't have made it if it was ocean all the way around because it would have been too far. He just got lucky that there was a continent in between. But it's not true that Columbus was the first to get the idea that the Earth was round. Everybody who was funding him already knew it was. They just didn't think he was going to make it anyway.
Yeah.
Well, maybe there was flat earthers back then too, though, right?
There were. I don't know, have we talked about on this podcast... Alfred Russel Wallace in the late 1800s, 1890s, I think, got into a debate with a flat earther. Did I ever tell this story? I love telling Alfred Russel Wallace stories because they're so interesting.
No.
They've had flat earthers as long as people have been telling people that the Earth is round, I'm sure. But in the 1890s, there's this loudmouth flat earther who was a rich guy basically, and he's he made a wager. He offered £10,000, I think, in the day's money, which would have been a huge amount of money, to any scientist who could devise an experiment to prove that the Earth was round. And Alfred Russel Wallace grew up working for his brother as a land surveyor, so he's like, oh, I can do this easily, right? So he found a canal that was very straight over multiple miles with several bridges over it. And he's like, all I have to do is, if the Earth is curved, then there's going to be curvature to the surface of the water when it's perfectly still. And if the surface of the water is perfectly flat over several miles, then obviously the Earth is flat. So he set up this experiment using boats and theodolites, optical levels, where you basically put 3 in a row. And if the center one is too high, then it's round. And if they're all perfectly aligned, then it's flat, right? And he proved it, and the guy's like, no, I disagree to these conditions. He's like, well, you agreed to them in the first place, but whatever, I'll revise it. So he revises it, and still shows that the Earth is round. The guy's like, no, I'm not paying out, and started a campaign to smear Alfred Russel Wallace. And so Alfred Russel Wallace basically spent his fortune in the last remaining decades of his life fighting legal battles against this guy who was slandering him.
Jeez.
And he's like, this is the worst decision of my life, to get into a fight with a flat earther. But the crazy thing is, have you guys seen the documentary Behind the Curve?
No.
Modern flat earther documentary that just came out a few years ago. They devise essentially an identical experiment using lasers instead of optical levels to test the curvature over still water, and they mess up. They can't get these lasers sighted right, so in the end they end up using just telescopes, exactly the same way as Wallace did it, and they basically prove exactly what Wallace did, that the Earth was round. And like, that's the spoiler for that documentary, is they basically prove themselves wrong in their own documentary. Well, I mean, they weren't making the documentary, but their big experiment to prove that the Earth is flat ended up proving that the Earth was round. But I'm sure that didn't convince them. I'm sure they just moved the goalposts and decided why that experiment didn't work.
I think Alfred Wallace would probably scream if he were to find out that we actually have like photographs of the Earth from space, and people still believe in the flat Earth, right?
I mean,
anyway, one other thing, let's talk a little bit more about the Magdalenian, because they use a little bit of specific terms here. He's got a tool, as we mentioned, and they look at it and they say it's a burin of a parrot beak, inclined chisel point, probably early Magdalenian. So I had to look this up. A parrot-beaked burin is actually a diagnostic tool from the Magdalenian culture. Except it wouldn't look anything like the one they actually had in the movie. The one they had was like tennis ball sized with a big point off the end of it, but a real Magdalenian parrot-beaked burin scraper would be probably a few centimeters long and a small flat tool. But I don't know anything about Magdalenian other than that, really.
Yeah, I had to check that. So they were definitely right in terms of the term itself. But the morphology of the object that they used in the movie doesn't fit with the description of burin. So burin is basically a type of lithic flake with a chisel-like edge, which prehistoric humans used for engraving or for carving bone and wood and stuff. So basically they did research, but they did not go as far as to look at the drawings of the tool itself, I guess.
It could be a matter of like cinematics, which we see a lot in a lot of the movies that we watch. An actual parrot beak burin from Magdalenian would be like maybe like poker chip sized and flat, and it wouldn't show up as well relative to a human hand,
right.
Or several characters. So they might have done that on purpose just so that we had more to look at. Although they could have made it look a little more refined. It kind of looks like a pretty early Acheulean style hand axe. It's pretty crude looking.
That's what I thought.
Indeed, and there is also one interesting thing. They ask him, "Do you remember your original language?" And he says, "I remember something." And at some point, the anthropologist Dan, he says that we think that the language came into existence 60,000 years ago, which we inferenced via culture. Which is basically, in terms of chronology, it's a bit tough. And it was exactly 2007 that they published the paper on Blombos in South Africa. Those famous geometric drawings, which they kind of used to interpret it that these points this basically says that humans had a language in those times, but Blombos are much older, right? They're like 160,000 years ago, and not 60. So
one of the things to consider is that this movie came out in 2007, but it was written in 1998, and so in terms of where we were with science at that time, this is right in line with an idea called variably the human revolution or the behavioral revolution. And this was supported by people like Richard Klein, I think, was a big supporter of this idea at the time, that there is this disconnect between anatomical modernity and behavioral modernity. So anatomically modern humans, at the time, we knew them as early as 200,000. Now we've extended that back over 300,000. And so basically, humans looked more or less like us hundreds of thousands of years ago. But we see changes in technology sort of abruptly in Europe about 40,000 years ago, and in the Middle East, 60 to 40,000 years ago. So there was an idea at the time that maybe even though humans looked like us, they weren't as smart as us. And maybe there was a brain mutation which suddenly made humans dramatically smarter. And Richard Klein in a paper suggested maybe it was like a single point mutation. Maybe there was, one base pair change in the human genome, and then suddenly humans are just geniuses. And that idea still floats around. Like I see that popping up on Reddit all the time these days still. But as far as I'm concerned, it was debunked completely in the year 2000 when a paper was published by McBrearty and Brooks called The Revolution That Wasn't.
Yeah.
And they basically summarized the entire African human fossil record for like 250,000 years. And they determined that this abrupt change in culture that we see in Europe obviously is because Neanderthals used to live in Europe, and then 40,000 years ago, modern humans come into Europe. So we have a shift between two different cultures, and modern humans are bringing their very different culture, and that's why it looks like a revolution, because it was one culture replacing another. But those modern humans evolved in Africa, and if we look at the fossil record or the archaeological record in Africa, we see all of these traits that we call modern traits emerging very slowly, sort of one at a time over 200,000 years. So really, there is no revolution. There's no point where we suddenly got really smart. It's like he says it in this movie. Humans have always been smart. They've always been as smart as we are today. They just didn't know as much. So it took a long time for all this cultural knowledge to accumulate and spread and become connected so that we can put it all together and make this technology. But part of this human revolution hypothesis was that humans didn't have language before 60,000 years ago. So even though I don't think anybody would agree with this today, certainly not anybody, of our generation, there might be some holdouts who were working in the 90s who would still be proponents of this, because even in science, it's harder for us to let go of our old ideas. But in 1998, this probably would have been a pretty well-accepted paradigm that maybe language did suddenly emerge 60,000 years ago, and that's why we suddenly have this explosion of art in the, at least in the European archaeological record.
Well, yeah, there is also another part of this story. The whole thing about behavioral modernity focuses on our own species, Homo sapiens. But now we know that many aspects of what we consider as modern behavior actually also were present in Neanderthal populations. So we know that Neanderthals buried their dead. We know that they probably made even some cave art around 60,000 years ago in Spain. And genetics has also revealed many important stuff. So, for example, today we know that Neanderthals had the same variant of the FOXP2 gene, which is an important gene for speech production. So this could suggest that adaptation to language basically evolved prior Neanderthals and modern humans diverged. So my own take on this story is that language probably existed much longer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
I think we were just talking about the Neanderthal hyoid bone in the last episode with Mariana Roxandich.
Yeah, the one from Kibata.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So yeah, all the anatomical evidence suggests that Neanderthals were capable of, roughly the same kind of speech as we are today, which doesn't really make any sense to evolve that, because the problem is there's a trade-off where now we can choke a lot easier because of the
Right.
anatomy of our airways for speech. So it wouldn't really make sense to evolve the ability to choke easier if you weren't also evolving the ability to speak to balance that out, right?
Right, right. So there is also another aspect. I think it was the psychiatrist, Dr. Will, who says at some point that prehistory was strongly patriarchal.
Oh yes, I saw that too.
Yeah, you surely remember your father. That's the quote. So what do you think about this?
Yeah.
Well, and there was this assumption that he wouldn't remember his mom. Like, no one even asked that. We're assuming he won't remember his mom, but he's going to remember his dad. Like,
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
in a patriarchal society, you still love your mom. Like,
In a patriarchal society, the mother is the one that spends more time with the children typically, right?
Right.
So wouldn't you remember your mother
yeah,
even better?
exactly. Yeah.
Maybe that's foreshadowing that he ended up being the psychiatrist's father in the end.
Oh yeah.
Somebody's
For
the baby daddy.
Yeah, and John, related to that particular issue, John says at one point that he remembers a male figure, but he's not sure if it is his father or brother or something else, which would imply that the group cared for their young, basically. So it would imply some interesting form of basically bringing up your children in the communal sense.
We could also talk about how this movie treats women, because we
Ooh.
have 8 characters, 8 main characters, and 3 of them are women. One of them is a love interest who doesn't really have much of a role other than that. One of them is a very young archaeology student who actually is one of my favorite characters, but like the relationship in there is problematic, and they don't suggest it's problematic. You have 7 professors and another professor, 7 professors, and one of them shows up with a first-year student, and they're like, "Nice to meet you, cool."
Yeah.
And towards the end of his story, I think it's the biologist says to him, "You've got 4 men of science completely baffled. Also, there are 3 women of science there too. Why are you focusing on 4 men of science, right?"
Yeah.
Yeah, and the woman that spoke the most, the religious one, she mainly was aggressively flirty with the guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And always in the background fixing stuff in the kitchen and packing. Like, she was always doing a little bit of domestic chores in the background, and then got overly sensitive about the religious stuff. Like, that was her entire character.
Mm-hmm.
So I noticed that, and that kind of annoyed me.
We do have 3 female characters, but I don't think it passes the Bechdel test, because I don't think that any of them even talk to each other. If they do, it's certainly about the main character. But then again, I guess everybody in the show is talking about the main character, so there's not really that much else that happens other than just talking about him.
No, but they still didn't develop a female character.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, at least this Linda student is smart until, as I already said, she asked about
The
the
dinosaur question.
yeah, and then she just killed me.
Here's a little sort of just interesting historical, like a recent historical wrinkle to this. When they're talking about how, he was Jesus, but he was just a man, and history has sort of rewritten it to deify him. And I think it's the archaeologist mentions how, think about how many conspiracy theories have built up around JFK's assassination in only, 50 years. And the biblical literalist says she doesn't think anybody will end up deifying Kennedy. I thought that was funny because it's not JFK, but JFK Jr. in just recent years has become part of a QAnon conspiracy where they think he's coming, or they thought he was going to come back from the dead to support Donald Trump. And they all... Do you remember this? Do you remember this a couple of years ago?
This is crazy.
All these QAnon supporters gathered in Dallas where JFK was shot because there was a prophecy that JFK Jr. was going to come back. I don't know if he was coming back from the dead or if he had been faking his death and was just returning 20 years later. And he was going to return on the spot where his father was assassinated, on the anniversary of his father's assassination, to support Donald Trump and reveal, reveal the conspiracy about Democrats drinking the blood of babies and stuff like this. So in only 20 years crazy? Since
like,
JFK Jr.'s
would just be like
but that's the thing. I mean, it was sort of a throwaway line here that she doesn't think anybody's going to deify Kennedy, but it's become even more prophetic because in only 20 years since JFK Jr.'s death, we already have conspiracy theories growing about him. We have an entire, essentially new religious movement growing up around stuff that's happening right now. So it's pretty easy to see how, even in our age of information, of easy access to information, if anything, that doesn't, prevent us from having misinformation. It just makes it way easier for things to become mythological, even within our own lifetimes.
Yeah, well, look at that John, what is it? Whatever, Hubbard.
L. Ron Hubbard?
The Scientology guy.
Oh.
Yeah.
Right.
Right? Like, he's on his way to it.
I mean, there are many strange cults which existed until recently and which still do. There is this interesting aspect of the whole Vice YouTube channel, where they actually frequently talk about these strange cults, and some people are way out there. Trust me.
Mm-hmm. I think I almost got what was that cult that was working just recently, and the women would talk to you on the street?
Where?
Tell us more.
In Canada?
Nexium.
Oh, Nexium.
All through the world.
Yeah, that was in Vancouver, right? When you were living in BC,
yeah.
I guess you would have been.
So I think I
almost
got sucked in because this really beautiful young woman was just really enthralled with me on the SkyTrain. She wanted me to meet her bosses, and she wanted to work with me and everything. And I was like, I kind of fell for it, and I was like, yeah, like I don't know, she got me sucked in. And then it wasn't
until
until
do you know Nexium?
No, but I'm gonna Google it definitely. I'm gonna read about it.
Yeah. And it's got this it wasn't until we were texting, and then she was so vague with her ideas that I'm like, it's either a market, like it's a multi-level marketing, but like the things that she was saying were so weird that I was like, I think you're in a cult. And then I blocked her. But I could see, like, it just really like if she got me, right? Like, I'm even heterosexual, and there was a point when I was like, is it a date? Oh, like, I don't know. She was good.
That's such a weird cult because it's not religious. It's like, what was it? It was like a business. It was like marketing or something.
Business cult.
It's like, yeah, it's almost like a lifestyle brand marketing.
It's got like the same vibes as like the crypto bro stuff, right?
Yeah, or like Goop or something, right? But it's all like they target women, and yeah, it was crazy. So I realized I have to be careful because apparently I was. If she had been smoother on text messages, who knows where I'd be right now.
That's one of the things I think about because, like, as a white male, I'm the target demographic for that, like. Toxic masculinity, Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I used to listen to a lot of Joe Rogan because he used to have a lot of scientists on. And then, there's a lot of people, like, I feel like I'm one of these people that could be right on the edge. If I wasn't a scientist studying at a university, surrounding myself with, people who value critical thinking, I very easily could have been drawn into the opposite side of that. And I could have become, just a horrible person today.
I know people, one in particular, who's a very good critical thinker, very good academic scientist, and he's fallen into it. And I think it's because and I read a book about it. It's called like Men That Hate Women or something. And it's like a lobster boiling. Like you go in just a little bit and everything is okay. And you just slowly get desensitized to it, and you get deeper and deeper without realizing it. And then before you know it, you're really into it and you've drank the Kool-Aid. And
Yeah,
it
if the
happens.
realization, like, oh, this is a cult, if that
Doesn't hit
doesn't
you.
happen before you're too deep into it, by the time you're deep into it, you can't accept that because it causes too much cognitive dissonance, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think all those cults and ideologies basically exploit some basic needs and
Mhm.
weaknesses that humans generally have. Uh, at least I think
Yeah.
an important component would be that people, well, not many people, including myself, we seek for answers. That's basically why we do science, for example. So we have this need to know answers to things, and the truth is that everything is multivariate and everything is extremely complex.
Mm-hmm.
And there is this ideology, this cult, this preacher, basically modern YouTube preacher, who comes and tells you and gives you basically a knife to cut Gordy's knot with it. And he says basically, this is truth. This is, this is the reason. And then it satisfies and feeds your need to have answers. But usually, as I've said, nature's
Mhm.
is
And it gives you a community for people who are
Right.
isolated.
Right. So, I mean, I guess that we all there is this substrate in all of us to, become basically prey for these people. But there is critical thinking, as Josh said, and we have to stick to that.
Well, this might be a good note to end this episode on. Getting into a little bit of deep thinking, kind of like the movie does. Starts off with some concrete archaeological stuff and ends on some big questions about human life in the 21st century.
With a bit of sexist stuff, because there is I just,
As always.
I just remember this one was pretty cheesy. So this girl who is in love with John at the end, when they talk at the porch, she says that 14,000 years, I bet you that's a lot of women. And I was like, oh God, did you really have to do that?
And he doesn't answer. He's like,
Yeah. He stayed silent like a gentleman. So basically, I really dig this movie. I really liked it. It got me into thinking, despite all inaccuracies and some facts which do not add up. It was a funny watch, especially if we consider the budget they had or did not have, right?
Yeah, this movie cost $200,000, which, I mean, to a person sounds like a lot of money. For a movie, that's amazingly cheap. It was filmed on camcorders, which is, like you can
that's
tell.
just their salaries, and that's...
Yeah. If you think about all the people that must have worked on this, that's like
But that's
less
not
than
even a high
$10,000 per person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Josh, we could make a movie, right?
We should. We should make a movie about. Did I ever tell you the story that Dave had about doing a sort of comedy drama series about the field school in Serbia because of all the people hooking up? It would make a really good series, right? With lots of drama. Think about all the drama that happens in the field every year, especially when we have the international students.
Yeah. Indeed.
I'm going to the field next week, and I've been told under no uncertain terms am I to date anybody until after school. I'm not in field school. But
this is the rule that Marianne always gave the students at the field school. No dating in the first 2 weeks is what she would always say.
Yeah.
So, low budget. The entire movie takes place in a single room with 8 people just talking, and somehow it still is a pretty good, interesting movie. One of the best ones we've watched, I think.
It was really interesting. Yeah, the story was really good. The way they made it work was really cute, and yeah, it was good.
So thanks for being
Good
with
choice.
us, Pedja.
Okay.
Thanks for choosing this one. Yeah, it was a great movie. Maybe we'll have you on again. You're the second guest to be on twice on this podcast at this point.
Yeah, well, it was pleasure. I mean, we always watch some good movies, which I wouldn't watch, I guess, if it wasn't a work, task.
What movie did you watch last time with us?
You missed that one.
Oh, that's
Kim.
one I missed. Right? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you've been enjoying Screens of the Stone Age, get in touch with us. Follow us on Twitter at SOTSA_podcast and on Facebook at SOTSA podcast, or send us an email to screensofthestoneage@gmail.com. Screens of the Stone Age is supported by the Paleoanthropological Society of Canada. Find out more at pasc-scpa.ca.